He shielded his mistress with his own body while his pregnant wife bled alone in the dark. Not a rumor, not a whisper passed between enemies. Every man in that room saw it happen. The dawn of the Romano Empire, the most feared name on the East Coast, throw himself over another woman while his 8 months pregnant bride lay buried under collapsed marble in an abandoned corridor, screaming into silence. No one came to answer. That one moment destroyed everything. If this story hits you somewhere deep, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. On. The night had started with champagne. That was the detail Vivian Ashcroft would remember years later, when the word justice finally meant something she could hold in her hands. Not the gunfire, not the smell of smoke threading through silk curtains, not the weight of fallen stone pressing against her spine while her unborn son kicked against her ribs in blind animal panic. She would remember the champagne, how it caught the chandelier light in her glass, how she turned it slowly between her fingers and watched the bubbles rise and disappear, and thought, something is wrong tonight. She had been thinking that for months. The Romano estate sat on 40 acres of private land outside of Harwick, a fictional upstate city where old money and organized crime had spent 3 generations pretending they were different things. The main house was a monument to controlled excess. Marble floors that cost more than most people's houses. Oil paintings hung with institutional precision, flower arrangements so large and architectural they looked like they'd been designed by someone who had never touched an actual flower. Damian Romano had built none of it. He had inherited every stone and every painting and every whispered reputation, and he wore it all the way another man might wear a well-cut suit, naturally, without self-consciousness, as if there had never been a version of him that existed without it. He was 41 years old and still moved through a room like he was cutting it in half. Vivian watched him from across the main hall, the way she had trained herself to watch him. With her face arranged into something pleasant and unreadable, her shoulders set, her spine straight. She was 28, and she had been raised by a father who ran the legitimate side of a criminal architecture she had understood perfectly by the time she was 14. She was not naive. She had never been naive. But she had been, at one specific moment 2 years ago, briefly stupid. Stupid in the way that only happens when a woman who has spent her entire life being careful makes one catastrophic exception. Damian had been that exception. She pressed one hand flat against the side of her belly, feeling the low, familiar ache that had been her constant companion for the past 3 weeks. 8 months. The pregnancy had not been graceful or cinematic. It had been exhausting and uncomfortable and lonely in the specific way that only happens when you are surrounded by people and still completely alone. She had morning sickness well into the 5th month. Her lower back had developed a grinding complaint that no amount of carefully recommended rest could silence. She slept badly and woke worse, and spent her days inside this enormous house learning, with increasing precision, exactly how little she mattered to the man whose child she was carrying. Not mattered in the domestic sense. Damian was not cruel to her, not openly. He was attentive in the mechanical way of a man performing a necessary function. He asked after her health, he sent doctors, he appeared at her side for the events that required his pregnant bride's presence. He was building something with this marriage, something calculated and political and necessary to the long game of the Romano Empire, and Vivian was part of that architecture the same way the oil paintings were, significant, expensive, and ultimately decorative. She had known that going in. What she had not fully accounted for was Selena. Selena Voss was 35 years old and had been beside Damian Romano for 11 years. She was not a secret. In the world Vivian inhabited, mistresses of powerful men were seldom secrets. They were acknowledged facts, like weather patterns, like the assumption of violence beneath every polished surface. What Vivian had underestimated, with consequences that had taken her months to fully measure, was the nature of what Selena was to Damian. It was not simply desire. It was not even primarily desire. Selena had spent 11 years becoming indispensable. She ran intelligence operations for the Romano organization, managed relationships with allied families, and had her fingers so deeply threaded through the organization's nervous system that removing her would have required, as Victor Hale had once said with his characteristic flatness, cutting out the whole spine. Victor Hale. 63 years old, thick through the chest, with hands that looked like they had been designed for a larger man, and a face that had been broken and reset enough times that it had developed its own geography. He had served the Romano family for 30 years, longer than Damien had been running it, and he occupied a strange position within the organization, trusted completely but never fully inside the inner circle, respected for his competence and his loyalty, and kept at a precise arm's length for reasons Vivian had only recently begun to understand. Victor was the only person in this entire house, on this entire estate, surrounded by this entire assembled collection of crime bosses and their retinues and their carefully dressed wives, who had ever spoken to Vivian like she was a person with a functioning brain. He appeared beside her now, without announcement, the way he always did. One moment the space next to her was empty, and then it wasn't. "You should eat something," he said. Not a greeting, just a statement. "I'm not hungry." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him sideways. He was watching the room with the particular stillness of a man who spent his entire professional life reading threat levels. His eyes moved in a slow, methodical sweep. Doorways, staff, the positions of Damien's security detail. She had started doing the same thing because watching Victor had taught her what to watch for. "Who's here tonight that shouldn't be?" she asked. A pause. Almost nothing, but she had learned to read his pauses the way other people read expressions. "Everyone who's here should be here," he said. "That's the problem." She didn't push it. She had learned not to push Victor directly. He gave you what he decided you needed, not what you asked for, and pressing him only made him quieter. Across the hall, Damien was moving through a cluster of men she recognized: Carver Tate from the Harwick Syndicate, two of the Breslin brothers from down the coast, an older man she didn't know whose name she would later learn and immediately wish she hadn't. They were laughing at something, the particular laugh of men who operate in spaces where laughter is also a form of territorial display. Damien's hand was on someone's shoulder. He was performing ease. He was very good at performing ease. And then Selena moved into the cluster from the far side, and the entire geometry of the room shifted. She was dark-haired with the kind of beauty that photographed as severity: sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes that registered color and detail with the flat efficiency of surveillance equipment. She wore a dress that cost more than Vivian had ever spent on anything before this life. And she wore it the way she wore everything, not for the room's appreciation, but as a kind of armor, a statement about who she was and what she expected. She said something to Damien, and he turned to her, and the performance of ease became something else. It became real. It became the unguarded version that Vivian had glimpsed exactly twice in their entire relationship, and it lasted only a second before Damien recalibrated, but a second was enough. Vivian took a slow breath through her nose. She was not jealous. She wanted to be very clear about that, even inside her own head. What she felt watching Damien look at Selena was not the sharp-edged thing of romantic injury. It was something colder and more strategic. It was the recognition that the power map she had drawn in her head of this organization was still wrong, still incomplete, and that whatever corrections she needed to make were probably urgent. "I need air," she told Victor. "Stay in the East Wing." "I know." She moved through the hall slowly, the way her body required her to move now, with deliberate care, with constant awareness of weight and balance. Several people made way for her with the particular deference that surrounds pregnant women at formal events, a combination of biological instinct and social performance that she had stopped finding either touching or irritating and had started simply accepting as one of the textures of her current existence. The east corridor was cooler than the main hall, the sound of the event dampening as she moved further from the central rooms. She had come to know this house in the way that people know spaces they cannot leave, intimately, sometimes resentfully, always precisely. She knew which floorboards recorded footsteps and which were silent. She knew where the gaps in the security camera coverage were, not because she had mapped them deliberately, but because she had spent months watching people move through this house and learning, from their movements and their omissions, where the blind spots fell. She was standing near the east wing window, one hand pressed to the small of her back, watching the dark tree line at the edge of the estate grounds, when she first heard it. Not gunfire. Not yet. Something earlier. A kind of pressure change in the building. an alteration in the frequency of sound that she felt in her chest before she understood it with her mind. Years later, she would describe it as the moment before, the single breath of silence that precedes catastrophe. But in the moment itself, it was just a feeling, sharp and sourceless, that made every muscle in her body go rigid. Then the lights went out. The entire estate dropped into darkness simultaneously. Not a flicker, not a surge, a complete and immediate severance, as if someone had simply reached up and pulled the night down over all of them. For a fraction of a second, there was nothing. No sound, no light, no movement. And then the screaming started in the main hall, and then the gunfire followed, and the two sounds merged into something that had no language, that was simply the pure oral signature of catastrophe. Vivienne pressed herself flat against the corridor wall. Her heart was slamming. The baby was kicking, hard, urgent, as if he too understood that something had changed. She pressed her hand against her belly and made herself breathe, made herself think, made herself count. Count the exits, count the sounds, triangulate the direction of the shots. The main hall, the northwest staircase, the front entrance, not this corridor, not yet. She heard shouts, organized and purposeful, beneath the chaos. Not the screaming of guests, but the clipped commands of trained men. Masks, she thought, even before she saw anything. She thought this was planned. She started moving, not toward the main hall, away from it, deeper into the east wing, toward the service exit she had cataloged 6 weeks ago when she was doing nothing more dangerous than learning the architecture of her own captivity. She moved as fast as her body allowed, which was not fast, which was the particular agony of those minutes. The slowness, the awareness of her own limitation, the baby's weight changing her center of gravity with every step. She heard the crash from the main hall. Something structural, something large giving way, the percussive report of it reverberating through the floor under her feet. Then a second crash, closer. Then the specific, catastrophic sound of a section of the interior scaffolding, the decorative framework supporting the east corridor's renovated ceiling, giving way in a chain of sequential failures. She had no time. She covered her head with both arms and dropped as low as her body would allow, pressing herself into the alcove beside a locked door. And the section of ceiling came down in a cascade of plaster and wooden framing and a single massive decorative beam that struck the corridor floor 8 feet from where she crouched and sent a shockwave through the marble that she felt in her knees, her spine, the base of her skull. Dust, darkness, the smell of old plaster and newer smoke threading through from somewhere further in the building. She was alive. She did a rapid inventory. Nothing broken, the baby still moving, a laceration on her left forearm from flying debris that was bleeding, but not dangerously. She pushed herself upright, coughing, and looked back toward the main hall. The corridor was blocked. Not entirely. There was a gap, a passage through the fallen debris that a person moving carefully might navigate, but she could see from the angle of collapse that the corridor between her and the main house was structurally compromised. And she could hear through the walls and the wreckage the ongoing chaos of the fight in the main hall. Gunfire, intermittent now, in bursts, men shouting, the specific horrible sound of breaking glass in quantity. She turned toward the service exit, and that was when she saw, through the gap in the collapsed corridor wall, through an accidental window the structural failure had opened into the main hall's eastern anteroom, exactly what she would spend the next 5 years carrying. Damian Romano was moving through the anteroom at speed. He had a weapon in his hand. He always had a weapon. The gun was as much a part of him as his jaw. And his security was around him. 2 men flanking him with the practiced geometry of professionals who had run this exact drill before. He was moving toward the exit. Moving fast. Moving with the specific, undivided focus of a man in survival mode. And Selena was pressed against his side. His arm was around her. Not the tactical arm of a man moving a civilian through a dangerous situation. The arm of a man protecting something he could not afford to lose, moving between her body and the direction of fire, his back slightly angled to absorb whatever came at them. He was shielding her, actively, deliberately, without hesitation or calculation. Vivienne watched this for exactly 3 seconds. 3 seconds was what the accidental window in the collapsed wall allowed before their path took them out of her sightline. She watched Damien Romano move his mistress through the darkness of a burning house, while his pregnant wife crouched alone in a blocked corridor with blood on her arm and plaster dust in her lungs. And then they were gone. She turned back toward the service exit. Her hands were steady. This surprised her. She had expected something, rage or grief, or the sharp collapse of whatever remained of her capacity for illusion. Instead, she felt something that was almost like clarity, the specific, horrible clarity that arrives when the thing you have been afraid to understand finally becomes undeniable. Not feeling nothing, feeling it all, but feeling it as information rather than injury. Processing it the way you process a diagnosis. This is what is true. This is what I'm dealing with. This is where I am. She pushed through the service door and into the cold night air. The grounds were chaos. She could see figures moving at the edges of the floodlights that the backup generators had partially restored. Security, she thought, and possibly attackers, and she had no reliable way to distinguish between them. She pressed herself against the exterior wall of the building and moved laterally, away from the main entrance, away from the sound of engines and shouted commands, and the particular frequency of organized violence. The lakeside grounds were darker. She moved toward the dark. She had been walking for 7 minutes, she thought, though time had become unreliable, stretched and compressed in ways she couldn't fully track. When a hand caught her arm from behind, and she turned with her elbow already moving and her weight shifted and her teeth set, prepared for anything. Victor Hale's face, gray in the darkness, 3 inches from hers. "Easy," he said. She went still. He looked at her arm, at the blood, at her face, in a rapid sequence of assessments. His expression changed by approximately nothing. "Can you walk?" "I'm walking." "Can you walk faster?" It was not a question. She answered it by turning and moving faster. He came up beside her and matched her pace without comment, without slowing, adapting to her rhythm the way a man adapts who has spent his life moving through situations where the options are adjust or fail. He had a bag over one shoulder that she hadn't seen him carrying inside. He had a weapon at his hip. He had the look of a man who had been prepared for exactly this event for a very long time. "Where are we going?" she asked. "Safe house, north of the lake." "Your safe house?" "Mine. Not the organization's." He looked at her with something that was almost, in his particular economy of expression, respect. "No." She processed this. "You knew this was going to happen." "I knew something was going to happen." "Did you know—" She stopped herself. "Not here. Not while moving through open ground in the dark with the sound of her husband's estate burning behind her. Not while every breath she took required a conscious act of management." She filed the question away and kept walking. The lakeside safe house was 2 miles through the estate's wooded back acreage, along a path that Victor appeared to know by memory, navigating without a light, moving through the dark with the patient certainty of a man who had made this journey in his head many times before making it with his feet. Vivienne kept pace. Her back was in ascending agony. The baby's kicks had settled into a rhythm that she interpreted, with the specific and slightly deranged fluency that 8 months of pregnancy had given her, as urgency rather than distress. They did not speak for most of the walk. There was nothing useful to say. She was cataloging what she knew, what she needed to know, what she could confirm, and what remained assumption. She was thinking about the 3 seconds in the collapsed corridor, the image of Damien's arm around Selena's body, the direction of his back. She was thinking about the planned quality of the attack, the simultaneous power failure, the structural breaches, the organized commands. She was thinking about the specific surgical nature of what appeared to be chaos. She was thinking, this was not random. The safe house was a single-story structure half hidden by overgrown willows at the lake's north edge, small and deliberately unremarkable. The kind of building that failed to register even when you were standing in front of it. Victor unlocked it with a key he produced from his jacket. Inside, a generator, which he started without ceremony, a bed, a medical kit, canned supplies. A landline phone mounted to the wall that she understood, without being told, connected to no network that anyone with the ability to search would find. She sat down on the edge of the bed because her body had made the decision before her mind did. The adrenaline was metabolizing. She could feel it. the specific and unpleasant crash of a body that has been running on emergency fuel and is now demanding payment. Victor opened the medical kit and came to her without asking permission. He cleaned the arm laceration with an efficiency that suggested significant prior practice, and she let him because it was the practical thing to do. "Tell me what you knew," she said. He worked for a moment without answering. "I knew the peace summit was cover. Every family on the East Coast in one place. That's not a peace summit. That's a target. I've been watching communication patterns for 6 months." Communication between who? Another pause. He put a strip of medical tape across the cleaned wound with a precision that was almost surgical. "I don't have confirmation yet." She looked at him directly. "Victor." He met her eyes. His face was the same as always, carved down to its essential planes by age and experience, giving nothing it hadn't decided to give. But in his eyes, which were the particular gray of old pewter, she saw something she hadn't seen there before. Not doubt. Something more specific than doubt. Something that looked like the particular weight of a man who has been carrying a terrible piece of knowledge and has not yet decided what to do with it. "You have a suspicion," she said. "I have more than a suspicion. But you won't tell me yet." "Not tonight." He stood, closed the medical kit, set it aside. "Tonight you need to rest, and I need to make 2 phone calls, and then we need to talk about what happens next." She wanted to push. Every part of her wanted to push, to demand the name, the evidence, the full shape of what he knew. But she was 8 months pregnant and bleeding and in a safe house in the dark, and her son was pressing his foot against the inside of her rib with what she had come to recognize as his resting state of impatient insistence. And Victor Hale was the only person on earth who had come for her tonight, and she was not stupid enough to fracture that by demanding more than he was ready to give. 2 phone calls, she said. 2. And then we talk. And then we talk. She lay back against the pillow and stared at the low ceiling and listened to the distant sound of what might have been sirens or wind, or her own pulse amplified by the particular acoustics of this small room and this large silence. Her hand rested on her belly. The baby kicked once, twice, settled. She thought about the champagne, the way the bubbles rose and disappeared, the way she had looked at them and thought, something is wrong tonight. She thought, I knew. She thought, I knew and I stayed. She thought about why she had stayed, not the political reasons, not the calculations she had made about safety and leverage, and what walking away from Damian Romano looked like in practical terms. She thought about the moment, 2 years ago, when she had made the exception, the exact texture of that specific stupidity. Not shame, exactly. Something more complicated than shame. The recognition of a gap between who she thought she was and what she had actually done. A gap she had spent the better part of 2 years refusing to fully look at. She was looking at it now. She was going to have to be different. Not better, not reformed in any moral sense. Simply different, stripped of the assumptions that had left her bleeding on a corridor floor while the man she'd built her life around carried another woman out of the fire. She was going to have to be the version of herself that she had been training toward without fully committing to. The version that moved through this world without illusions, without the weight of what she had wanted it to be. She was going to need Victor's information. She was going to need to be patient enough to wait for it. She closed her eyes and did not sleep and listened to Victor's voice in the other room, low, flat, absolutely controlled, and tried to hear the words and couldn't and didn't push, and lay in the dark with her hand on her son's restless movement and thought, we survived tonight. That's the beginning. The sirens in the distance grew louder and then faded and then stopped entirely, and the night settled back into its ordinary weight, and somewhere across the lake the Romano estate was either burning or being secured, and Damian Romano was either searching for his missing wife or he wasn't, and Selena Voss was either standing beside him or she was somewhere else planning the next move in a game that Vivienne was only beginning to understand the full dimensions of. Victor came back into the room. He looked at her. She looked at him. The people I trust know you're alive, he said. That's 3 people. Everyone else, everyone in the organization, every family, every allied contact, they're going to hear that Vivienne Romano and the child didn't survive the attack. She absorbed this. And Damian. A pause that told her everything. Damian, Victor said carefully, is going to hear what everyone else hears. The room was very quiet. She understood what he was telling her. She understood what it meant, what it required, what it was going to cost. She understood that the next chapter of her life, and her son's life, was going to be built entirely on a foundation of being dead. Okay, she said. Victor nodded once. He turned toward the door. Victor? He stopped. You said you had more than a suspicion. She kept her voice level, kept it precise. About who ordered the attack. He didn't turn around. His hand was on the door frame. She watched the back of his neck, the set of his shoulders, the particular quality of stillness that he had when he was making a decision about how much truth the moment required. Get some sleep, he said. We'll need to move before dawn. He stepped out. The door didn't close all the way behind him. A sliver of light from the outer room fell across the floor. She stared at it. Her hand was still on her belly. The baby had gone quiet. Finally, the restless kicking stilled into the deep, unknowing peace of the not yet born. She thought, he knows the name. She thought, and whatever that name is, it frightens him. That was the thing that should have terrified her. Victor Hale, who had spent 30 years in the machinery of the Romano Empire, who had seen and done things she would never know the full measure of, who treated violence with the professional detachment of a man who had long since made his peace with the world's capacity for it. Victor Hale was frightened, and he wouldn't say the name. Not yet. She stared at the sliver of light on the floor and did not sleep and did not stop thinking, and somewhere in the small hours before dawn, with the lake lying dark and silent beyond the willow trees, the shape of the thing Victor was protecting her from began to assemble itself in the back of her mind. Incomplete, shadowy, missing the final piece that would make it undeniable. She almost had it. Almost. And then the sound came. Not from outside, not from the direction of the estate, but from within the room itself. A low, warning creak from the floorboards near the window, and Victor's voice from the outer room, sharp and immediate. Down! The creak came again. Victor was already moving. She could hear him, the flat-footed speed of a large man who had learned decades ago to move without telegraphing his weight. Something scraped against the outer wall of the safe house, and then there was a silence that was worse than the sound, the specific silence of something outside deciding whether to commit. Vivian rolled off the bed. Not gracefully. There was no graceful in 8 months pregnant. There was only the urgent negotiation between intention and body, the shift of weight, and the swing of legs, and the floor coming up to meet her feet with a jolt that sent a spike of pain through her lower back that she noted and filed and refused to prioritize. She pressed herself against the wall beside the door and breathed through her nose, shallow and controlled, the way she had taught herself to breathe when she needed her hands to be steady. Victor appeared in the doorframe. He had his weapon up. He looked at her position against the wall and gave a short nod. The minimum possible acknowledgement that she had done the right thing without wasting any attention on the fact that she had. He mouthed, 1. She mouthed back, window or door. He held up 2 fingers, pointed at the window, then made a lateral gesture toward the exterior wall, someone moving along the outside of the building, circling. She reached across the narrow space between them and touched his arm. He looked at her. She pointed to herself, then to the landline phone mounted on the outer room wall. His jaw tightened. A fraction of a second of calculation, the kind of calculation she had come to recognize in men like Victor. Rapid, unglamorous, entirely about outcomes. Then another nod. She moved into the outer room low and fast, keeping below the window line, the floor cold under her bare feet, and got her hand on the phone. Lifted the receiver. No dial tone. She pressed the cradle twice. Nothing. Cut. Of course it was cut. She set the receiver down without sound and turned back toward the bedroom door. Victor was no longer in it. She could hear him. Or rather, she could track his position by the absence of his sound, the deliberate negative space he left in the building's ambient noise. She had gotten good at this, at reading the world through subtraction rather than addition, through what was missing rather than what was there. The window on the south wall shattered inward. The figure came through it fast and low, and Victor was already pivoting, already bringing the weapon around, but the figure wasn't coming for them. It was coming for the floor, taking the impact on its shoulder and rolling and coming up with both hands visible, empty. A reflex Vivian recognized as the specific body language of someone who very much did not want to be shot. "Don't," a man's voice, young, breathing hard. I'm alone. I swear to you I am alone. Don't shoot." Victor held position. "Name." Marcus Hale." A beat. "I'm your nephew." The silence that followed this had a texture to it. Not shock exactly, but something in the neighborhood of shock recalibrating into something more complicated. Victor's weapon arm didn't drop. His face did something small and controlled that Vivian filed away to ask about later. "Marcus," Victor said, "why are you here?" "Because the estate is locked down. Romano's people are everywhere. They've blocked every road north. I've been running through the woods for an hour." He was catching his breath. He was young, mid-20s, lean in the way of someone who moved a lot, with a cut above his left eyebrow that had bled freely down his face and was now drying in the cold. "I didn't know where else to go. I didn't know you had anyone here." His eyes moved to Vivian. She watched the recognition cross his face, not of her specifically, but of the situation, of what her presence in this particular location with her particular condition meant. He had the sense not to say anything about it. "How did you find this place?" Victor said. "I followed you once, 3 months ago." No apology in it, just a fact, delivered with the particular directness of someone who has decided that the current situation makes careful omissions more dangerous than honesty. "You left the estate at 2 in the morning, and I was having trouble sleeping, and He stopped, recalibrated. "I was worried about you. You were surveilling me. I was worried about you." He met Victor's eyes with the specific stubbornness of a young man who is also, somewhere under the adrenaline and the blood drying on his face, genuinely frightened. "There's a difference." Victor lowered the weapon. He didn't holster it, but he lowered it, which Vivian had learned was Victor's version of extending trust. "Sit down," he said. "Don't touch anything." Marcus sat down on the floor. He didn't reach for the chair. He just folded himself down onto the floor like his legs had decided to make the decision for him, and pressed his back against the wall and breathed. Vivian stayed where she was. She looked at Victor. "Your nephew," she said. "My brother's son." "Is he in the organization?" "No." The word came out flat and final, and Marcus looked up when he heard it, and something passed between the two of them. Not a look exactly, more a resonance, the frequency of a conversation that had been had before and hadn't been resolved. "He is not in the organization," Marcus said quietly. "Not yet." Victor turned and walked to the window Marcus had come through and looked out into the dark. He stood there for a long moment. Vivian could see the tension in his shoulders. Not fear, not quite, but something adjacent to it. The tension of a man whose carefully constructed plan has just acquired a new variable. "What did you see at the estate?" Victor said, still facing the window. Everything fell apart at once. The power went first. Then the shooting started before anyone could get oriented. It was... Whoever planned it knew the layout. They knew exactly where the security overlap was. The northwest corridor. "Yeah." Marcus looked at Victor's back. "How did you know that?" "Because it's the only gap." Victor turned around. "Who else got out?" "Romano. His people got him and Selena Voss out through the garage. I saw them leave." A pause. He was looking at Vivian when he said the next part, and his voice was careful in the way of someone choosing every word with awareness of what it carries. "I didn't see anyone else come out from the East Wing." The room was very quiet. "Mrs. Romano got out," Victor said. "That's all you need to know." Marcus absorbed this. He looked at Vivian again with the particular expression of someone doing rapid math and arriving at an answer they have the good sense not to say aloud. He nodded, once. "The attackers," Victor said. "Tell me what you saw." "Organized. Definitely not a single crew. There were too many of them. They were covering too many positions simultaneously. Professional. They knew which guests to ignore and which ones to..." He stopped. His jaw set. Something moved behind his eyes that Vivian read as the specific processing lag that happens when violence gets close enough to be personal. Carver Tate is dead. 2 of his people. The Breslin brothers got out, but one of them was hit. The older man who was talking to Romano. I don't know his name. I saw him go down in the main hall. Ben Castillo, Victor said. Was he important? He was the primary diplomatic contact between the Romano family and the Western Syndicate. Victor said this without inflection, in the tone of a man making notes rather than a man expressing grief. But Vivian caught the brief, barely visible tightening around his eyes that indicated the word important was doing a great deal of insufficient work. His death is going to be read as a message. A message to who? That's the right question. Victor moved back toward the center of the room. He looked at Vivian, and in that look was everything he hadn't said out loud. The suspicion he was still carrying, the name he still hadn't given her, the shape of the thing she had been assembling in her head in the dark. We move at 4. There's a vehicle a quarter-mile northeast under a tarp near the old maintenance road. Marcus, you're coming with us because I can't leave you here, and I can't risk you being found. Where are we going? Marcus said. Further north. I know a place. For how long? Victor looked at him. I don't know yet. It was the most honest thing she had heard him say. It should have been frightening. Victor admitting the limits of his own planning. Victor without a complete answer. Instead, it settled something in her, some tight-wound thing she hadn't known she was bracing against. He was not omniscient. He was not operating from a complete map. He was, like her, working with incomplete information and trying to make the best of it. That was somehow easier to trust than certainty would have been. They left the safe house at 4:14 in the morning, single file through the willow trees to the maintenance road, and the vehicle was there. An old work truck, anonymous and unremarkable, with a full tank and 2 emergency bags already loaded in the back that told Vivian this exit had been staged long before tonight. She climbed into the cab with the specific ungainliness of late pregnancy and didn't comment on the pain, and Victor drove without headlights until they reached the county road, and Marcus sat in the back with his head against the window, and the cut above his eyebrow had stopped bleeding, and none of them spoke. She watched the dark fields roll past and thought about Damien. Not with longing. She needed to be clear about that. She thought about him the way you think about a structural element that has failed, carefully, analytically, trying to understand the exact nature of the failure so you could account for it. She thought about the way he had looked at her in the early months, before Selena's influence had fully reasserted itself, before the political architecture of their marriage had calcified into its current shape. She thought about whether any of it had been real, and decided that the question was unanswerable, and also, right now, irrelevant. The relevant question was, what was he going to do when he found out she was dead? The second relevant question, the one that kept surfacing beneath the first, was, what had he known going into tonight? She didn't think he had known. She had watched Damien Romano perform surprise, and she had watched him experience it, and tonight, in the brief, fractured glimpse she had through the collapsed corridor wall, she had seen something on his face that looked like the real thing, fear, unfiltered and unglamorous, the face beneath the face, which was the face she had seen exactly twice before. Once when she told him she was pregnant, and once on a night 8 months ago when a meeting had gone wrong and he had come home at 2 a.m. and sat in the kitchen in his coat and didn't move for 20 minutes while she watched from the doorway, and he hadn't known she was there. He didn't know. She believed that. What she didn't know, what Victor didn't know, or wouldn't say, was who had used his blindness against her. They drove for 3 hours. The sky went from black to the specific dark blue that precedes dawn, and then the blue began to lighten at the horizon, and Vivian watched it happen the way she had watched a great many things recently, with complete attention, storing the detail, as if some part of her understood that she was in a period where nothing could afford to go unregistered. The second safe house was further north than she'd expected, up into a region of the state where the land went rough and forested, and the infrastructure thin to county roads and scattered properties with long setbacks from the road. A farmhouse, white-clabbered, with a barn that was being used as something other than a barn. Victor parked around the back, out of sightline from the road. A woman opened the back door before they reached it. 60s, weathered in the specific way of someone who has spent a lot of time outdoors in difficult conditions, with the kind of stillness that Vivian recognized as the female equivalent of Victor's particular economy. She looked at the three of them with a comprehensive and rapid assessment. "Kitchen," she said, and stood aside. "Who is she?" Vivian asked Victor quietly. "Someone who owes me 30 years of favors," he said. "Her name is Ruth. She won't ask you questions." Ruth did not ask questions. She put coffee on the table and a bowl of oatmeal in front of Vivian with the brisk efficiency of someone who has run a household that included men coming and going at strange hours for a long time. And then she left the kitchen and didn't return. And that was the entirety of the introduction. Marcus wrapped both hands around a coffee mug and stared into it. In the kitchen light, the cut above his eyebrow looked worse. It needed closure. It needed cleaning again. It needed things that were not, right now, the priority. "Victor," Vivian said. She set down her spoon. She had eaten half the oatmeal because her son's requirements did not pause for crisis, but now she was done. "You said last night that you had more than a suspicion. We're not in the estate. We're not in the safe house. We're 3 hours from Harwick, and I've been patient, and I need you to tell me what you know." Victor wrapped his hands around his own mug. He did not drink from it. He looked at the table between them. "Selena Voss has been running a secondary intelligence operation inside the Romano organization for at least 3 years," he said. "Not for Damien, for herself." She waited. "She has relationships with 2 of the families that were at tonight's summit. Not the kind of relationships that go in the official ledgers, the other kind. Mutual insurance, shared leverage. She's been routing money through ghost accounts in the organization's name that Damien doesn't know about, building a reserve she controls entirely." "Building toward what?" Marcus said. Victor looked at him. A long pause that was a decision about how much to let him in. The attack tonight was designed to look like an external threat. A rival syndicate making a move against the peace summit. Clean, readable, the kind of move that has a logic everyone in the organization understands. He looked at Vivian. But it wasn't a move against the summit. She heard her own voice come out very steady. "It was a move against me. And the child." He said it without softening it, because softening it would have been an insult to her intelligence, and Victor Hale was many things, but he was not insulting. The attack on the summit was cover. The structural failure in the East Wing, the section of ceiling that came down, that was not coincidental. There are marks on those support columns. Someone weakened them in advance. The ceiling was meant to come down on whoever was standing in that corridor. The kitchen was very quiet. Marcus set down his mug. Vivian watched him process it. The rapid journey from comprehension to implication to the particular sick recognition that arrives when something shifts from political to personal. "She tried to kill her," Marcus said. "She tried to kill both of them," Victor said. Vivian's hand went to her belly. It was automatic. Not a gesture, not a performance. Just a body responding to a threat before the mind had finished articulating it. The baby shifted under her palm, a slow and lazy movement that felt, in the context of what she had just heard, unbearably precious. "How long have you known?" she said. "I've been building the picture for 6 months." Victor met her eyes. "I didn't have enough to be certain until 2 weeks ago. I was going to bring it to—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a fraction of a second. "I hadn't decided who to bring it to." "Damien." "He would have—" Another stop. This one longer. She watched Victor work through something internal with the specific expression of a man wrestling with a loyalty that has been placed in direct conflict with itself. "He would have protected her," Vivian said. Victor said nothing. "You've known Damien Romano for 30 years, she said, "and you didn't bring him evidence that the woman he trusts most in the world tried to have his pregnant wife killed because you weren't certain he wouldn't—" She stopped herself. The sentence had somewhere it could go, and she didn't let it go there. Not yet. "I needed more than evidence," Victor said. "I needed something that couldn't be unmade. Something she couldn't talk him out of." The silence settled. "So the plan," Marcus said slowly. "What's the plan now?" "Now we wait," Victor said. "For what?" "For Damien to launch his war against whoever he thinks did this. For Selena to manage his rage and keep him pointed in the wrong direction. For her to make a mistake. He looked at Vivian. And for me to find the financial records I haven't been able to get to yet. They're in the estate, in a system I can't access remotely. The estate that's currently locked down by Damien's people, Marcus said. Yes. How long? I don't know. Weeks? Months? Victor looked at him with the patience of a man who has answered this question once and considers that sufficient. I don't know. Vivian stood up. The movement cost her something. Her back registered its complaint at full volume. But she stood and went to the kitchen window and looked out at the barn and the lightning sky and the tree line beyond. She breathed. She was thinking about 5 years. Not because she knew it would be 5. She didn't know how long any of this would take. She had no reliable map for the territory she was entering. She was thinking about 5 years because her father had once told her that any situation you need to outlast has to be measured in something large enough to actually contain it. And she had grown up watching him measure things in years rather than months or weeks. And she had learned from that, had understood even as a teenager that short-term thinking was the particular failure mode of people who were not actually serious about winning. She was serious about winning. The child, she said, still facing the window, when everyone in the organization hears that we're dead. When Damien hears it. What happens to the Romano succession? Victor said carefully. It becomes uncertain. Which means Selena's position strengthens significantly. Which means she'll push him toward a consolidation, toward making the organization's future dependent on her, Victor said. Yes. She turned around. So the longer we stay dead, the stronger her position becomes. Also yes. And the longer we stay dead, the longer we have to build the case against her. He looked at her without expression for a moment. Then, with a precision that was almost like appreciation, that's the calculation I've been running. It's a terrible calculation, Marcus said. All the good ones are, Vivian said. She sat back down. She picked up her spoon and finished the oatmeal because her son needed it, and because she needed the calories, and because there was a particular kind of discipline in continuing to do ordinary things inside extraordinary circumstances. She had seen her father do this. She had never fully understood it until now. The days that followed were a specific kind of difficult that she had no previous frame for. Not the acute difficulty of the estate, of gunfire and darkness and debris. That had been fear, clean and immediate, which the body knew how to handle. This was the slow difficulty of waiting, of a life reduced to the dimensions of a farmhouse and a small radius of woods, and the constant grinding discipline of not knowing what was happening, of being removed from the information that would determine everything about her future. Ruth moved through the house with complete equanimity. She brought meals and fresh linens and once, without comment, a box of infant supplies that made Vivian's throat close briefly before she brought herself back. She seemed to require nothing from them. No explanation, no gratitude, no conversation beyond the strictly functional. Vivian found herself respecting this with a depth that surprised her. Marcus was harder to manage. He was young, and he was not built for waiting. He moved through the farmhouse with the coiled energy of someone whose body was designed for action and who had been asked to suspend that function indefinitely. He did useful things. He repaired a section of fence. He restacked firewood. He went over the vehicle's mechanical condition with a thoroughness that suggested either genuine expertise or a very successful imitation of it. But underneath the useful things was the barely contained urgency of someone who wanted to be doing something that mattered. On the 4th day, he came and found her where she was sitting on the porch in the late afternoon light, and he stood against the railing and looked out at the field and said, "My uncle is worried about something he's not telling us." "He's always worried about something he's not telling us," Vivian said. "This is different." He turned to look at her. His cut had closed into a healing line, narrow and red. "Something came through on the radio this morning. Some report about the summit aftermath. He turned it off when he saw I was listening." She considered this. "What did you hear before he turned it off?" "Something about Damien Romano launching a joint action against the Lang Syndicate, blaming them for the attack." "He's found a target," she said. "A wrong target." "Yes." Marcus was quiet for a moment. He had his arms crossed and he was looking at the field with the expression of someone working through something they don't have quite enough information to fully resolve. He was smart, she had decided, not Victor's particular brand of operational intelligence, but a different kind, faster and more intuitive, less careful. The kind that got things right quickly and also got things catastrophically wrong with approximately equal frequency. If Romano goes to war with the Leng Syndicate, he said, and the Leng Syndicate didn't do it, that's a war with no win condition. He'll spend everything he has fighting an enemy who has no reason to back down because they have nothing to apologize for. That's exactly right, Vivian said, and Selena knows that. Selena planned for that. He turned to look at her fully. She's not just trying to eliminate you. She's trying to use Damien to destroy the organization, reduce it to nothing so she can rebuild it from the foundation up with herself at the center. Or take what's left of it to one of the allied families who's already in her pocket and position herself as the woman who survived the Romano collapse. She looked at him. Either way, she wins and everyone else loses. So we need to move faster, he said. We need to move at the right time, she said. Not faster. Your uncle knows the difference. He looked like he wanted to argue and was making the decision not to. She found this impressive. 24-year-olds who could stop themselves from arguing a point they hadn't fully thought through were rarer than the alternative. Victor came back from a walk at dusk. Not a real walk. She had understood within the first 2 days that his walks were phone calls made from the tree line where the farmhouse's limited signal was cleanest, with a new quality of stillness that she read as the aftermath of difficult information. He sat at the kitchen table and did not eat the dinner Ruth had left and stared at the wood grain. She sat down across from him. Marcus stayed in the doorway. Tell me, she said. Romano hit 2 of the Leng Syndicate's supply lines last night. 3 of Leng's men are dead. 1 of Romano's lieutenants is in the hospital. Won't talk, but he won't walk again either. Victor pressed the flat of his hand against the table. Leng has called for a response. Every family that was at the summit is going to have to pick a side. How long before it escalates beyond repair, she said. Weeks. Maybe less if Leng decides to make a statement. He looked at her. There was something else. One of my contacts at the estate. She's still there. She's trusted. She's been watching. What? Selena moved into the main house 3 days after the attack. She's been running intelligence briefings from Damien's own office. She has access to the Romano family accounts, both the official ones and 2 of the secondary ledgers. He paused. Damien gave her access. The kitchen was completely quiet. He's grieving, Marcus said from the doorway. His voice was careful. He's grieving and she's managing that grief, Victor said. Every day that passes, her position consolidates. Every asset she touches becomes an asset she controls. Vivian pressed both hands flat on the table. She felt the familiar low ache at the base of her spine, and underneath it, very close, the larger and more complicated ache of understanding exactly how well Selena had constructed this. The elegance of it was nauseating. You didn't just kill the threat, you killed the threat. Then you occupied the grief of the man who had loved the threat insufficiently, and you used that grief as the door through which you walked into everything you had always wanted. You made the murder do double work. It was genius. She hated that it was genius. The financial records, she said, the ones in the estate. What do they contain? Proof of the payments to the crew that ran the attack. Proof of the communication between Selena and 2 of the men who were present at the summit, men who were supposed to be Romano allies, who helped her stage the structural failure in the East Wing. And you can't get to them remotely. They're on an air-gapped system, physical access only, which means someone has to go back into the estate. Victor looked at her without saying anything. Not me, she said immediately, before he could say it. Not for the obvious reasons, and also because if I'm seen alive before we're ready, the entire, I know, he said. Marcus? She said. Marcus straightened in the doorway. Victor shook his head. He doesn't have the access codes. He's never been inside the estate's operational systems. He'd be identified immediately. Your contact, Vivian said. The woman who's still there. She's trusted, but she's not trusted enough to be near that system. The room it's in requires a senior staff authorization. He paused. There are 4 people in the Romano organization with that authorization. Who? Damien, Selena, the head of security, who is currently in the hospital with 2 broken ribs, and me. She looked at him. He looked back at her. You have to go back, she said. I have to go back. And if Selena's been watching for you, she probably has. And if Damien, she stopped. Does Damien know you made it out? He knows I wasn't found on the estate grounds. He knows I wasn't with his convoy. Whether he's drawn the obvious conclusion. Victor spread his hands briefly on the table, a gesture that was his version of a shrug. I don't know what Selena has told him about me. This was the thing that landed the hardest, she realized, not the danger of Victor going back into the estate, the uncertainty of where Damien stood. She could plan against Selena. Selena was comprehensible. Her logic was consistent and followable even when it was monstrous. But Damien, grieving and manipulated and pointed at the wrong enemy, Damien with Selena's hands on his information and his accounts and his rage, that Damien was not comprehensible, that Damien could do almost anything. How long do you need inside, she said. 20 minutes with the system, 10 if nothing goes wrong. Nothing is going to go according to plan, Marcus said from the doorway. It never does. Then I'll need whatever time I need. Victor looked at him. You're going to stay here. You're going to stay here, Victor said, with a quietness that was more absolute than volume. And you're going to keep Mrs. Romano safe. And that is your job, your only job. Do you understand me? Marcus's jaw tightened. He looked at Vivian, who did not offer him an ally because she agreed with Victor on this particular point. Then he looked back at Victor and nodded, the nod of someone accepting a constraint they fundamentally dislike. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway. She looked at the 3 of them with her comprehensive, quiet assessment, and then she said, There's going to be a storm tonight. Victor looked at her. How bad? Bad enough that no one's going to be watching a maintenance road. A silence. That's not a coincidence, Marcus said. No, Ruth said, and left. Victor and Vivian looked at each other. She planned for this too, Vivian said. She plans for a lot of things. Who is she? Victor stood up from the table. Someone who used to be in a position very similar to the one you're in now. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and came out the other side. He left the kitchen. She heard him moving in the outer room, the quiet preparations of a man who knows how to prepare to go into danger. Efficient, unhurried, without the performance of courage that would indicate the real thing was absent. She sat alone at the table. The storm Ruth had promised was beginning at the edges of the sky, visible through the kitchen window, a darkening of the northwest horizon, the specific purple-gray of a Sirius system moving in. She watched it come the way she had been watching everything lately, with complete attention, storing the detail. Her son kicked once, deliberate as a declaration. She pressed her hand flat to her belly and thought, I know. She was going into labor, not full labor, not yet, not the kind that left no options. But the low, insistent pressure that had been building since dawn had shifted into something with a different character, something more rhythmic and more purposeful. And she had been ignoring it because the timing was catastrophically inconvenient and because she was not in the habit of surrendering to inconvenient things. But sitting alone in Ruth's kitchen with the storm coming and Victor about to walk back into the lion's den with a set of air-gapped financial records as the only thing standing between justice and oblivion, she understood that her body had made a decision that her mind was going to have to accommodate. She stood up. She went to the doorway. Ruth, she said. Ruth appeared at the end of the hall with the same unsurprised composure she brought to everything. I think, Vivian said carefully, that we have a timing problem. Ruth looked at her for 1 second. Then she turned back down the hall and called out, Victor, change of plan. The storm hit the farmhouse at 9:14 that night, and somewhere between the first crack of thunder and the second, in a back bedroom with Ruth's hands, and Marcus pacing in the hall and Victor standing in the doorway with his jacket still on, because he had not yet left and now could not, Vivian Ashcroft Romano's son came into the world 6 weeks early and entirely furious about it, which she found, in the narrow space of consciousness, that was still capable of finding anything, completely appropriate. He was small. He was loud. He had Damien's gray eyes, which she had not been prepared for, which was the only thing in the entire catastrophic sequence of the past week that actually broke through the wall she had built. She held him and did not cry. She had decided she was not going to cry, and she did not, but it was the closest thing to a real decision she'd made yet. Victor stood in the doorway looking at the child with an expression she had never seen on his face before. Something that was not quite grief and not quite wonder, but occupied the territory between them. He looked at her over the infant's head. "We have a problem," he said. "We have several. A specific new one." He came into the room. He spoke quietly, which was not unusual, but with a care in the word placement that she recognized as the signal that what he was about to say required her complete and undivided processing. "My contact at the estate sent an emergency message before I lost signal in the storm." She looked at him. "Selena doesn't believe you're dead," he said. "She told Damien this afternoon that she thinks the reports are wrong, that I helped you get out, that you're alive somewhere and building a case against her." The room felt very still. The baby made a small sound against her chest, the specific sound of a new person discovering breath. "She's looking for us," Vivian said. "She has people looking." "Yes." "Which means our timeline just changed," Victor said. "Completely." She looked down at her son. His gray eyes were unfocused, moving with the slow, searching motion of someone learning what eyes are for. She thought about Selena Voss, sitting in Damien's office, running his accounts, feeding him intelligence and managing his grief, and now doing the one thing that changed the entire shape of this game. Selena was not going to wait for them to come to her. Selena was coming. For 3 days after the birth, Vivian did not leave the back bedroom. Not because she couldn't. Ruth had delivered the baby with the competence of someone who had done this before under conditions that didn't invite questions. And the birth, though early, had been clean by the standards of the situation. The boy was small but breathing. His lungs were working. His gray eyes tracked light with the slow, investigative focus of a person conducting a serious assessment of an unfamiliar environment. He was, by every available measure, intact. She stayed in the bedroom because the bedroom was where she could think. She had named him Thomas. Not for anyone. Not for any reason she could articulate beyond the fact that the name was plain and sturdy and belonged to no one in the Romano organization and no one in her own family history, which meant it carried no weight except its own. Thomas Romano, who would not be called Thomas Romano for a very long time, who would be called something else entirely in whatever life Victor was building toward. Thomas, who had Damien's eyes and her jaw, and who, on the second day, had wrapped his entire hand around her index finger with a grip that was startlingly firm for someone who weighed just over 5 pounds and had been in the world for less than 40 hours. She sat with him and thought about timelines. Victor had not yet gone back to the estate. The storm had made the decision for him on the first night, and then the birth had made the decision for him on the second, and on the third morning he came into the bedroom doorway, and she could see in his posture the weight of every hour that had passed since his contact's warning. "How bad is it?" she said, without looking up from Thomas. "Selena has sent 2 search teams north." He leaned against the doorframe. "They're working through the county in a grid. They're not law enforcement, they're her own people, and they're asking questions at every property within 30 miles. How long before they reach this radius? 2 days, maybe 3 if they're thorough and slow. Less if someone talks." Ruth. No. The single word was absolute. Not Ruth. She looked up. "I'm not questioning her loyalty. I'm asking what her exposure looks like to someone who doesn't know her." Victor considered this. "She's not connected to the Romano family in any record. She's not connected to me in any record. The property is in a name that requires 3 steps of legal research to trace." He paused. "But if the search teams get close enough to physically survey the property, the truck is a problem. Move the truck." "Marcus moved it last night. It's 3 miles east under a different tarp." She nodded. She looked back at Thomas, who was asleep with the complete and unguarded abandonment of someone who has not yet learned that the world requires vigilance. She watched his chest rise and fall. "You need to go to the estate," she said. Yes. And you need to go today. Yes. Take Marcus. A pause. Marcus is your security. Marcus is 24 years old and he's been pacing this farmhouse for 3 days. And if you don't give him something to do with his body, he's going to make a mistake out of sheer pressure. She met Victor's eyes. And you might need a driver. You might need someone outside while you're inside. Take him. Victor looked at her for a long moment with the expression of a man evaluating an argument he doesn't want to concede. Then, Ruth stays with you. Obviously. You don't open the door for anyone who isn't Ruth or Marcus or me. Victor, I need to say it. Then say it and go. He said it. Then he went. She listened to the truck. Marcus had retrieved it, apparently, at some point in the pre-dawn hours she had mostly slept through, pull out from behind the barn and move down the access road toward the county road. And then the sound thinned and disappeared and the farmhouse was quiet, except for Thomas's breathing and the wind and Ruth moving in the kitchen with her permanent, unruffled efficiency. The quiet lasted 4 hours. She used it. She had asked Ruth for paper on the second day. Plain paper, nothing remarkable, and a pen. And she had been building a map of everything she knew. Not literally a map. She didn't draw diagrams or charts. She wrote in plain sentences, one below the other, the way she had been taught to think through complex problems by a father who believed that the act of writing forced precision in a way that thinking alone did not. She wrote what she knew as fact, what she knew as high-probability inference, and what she suspected but could not yet support. The fact column was shorter than she wanted. The inference column was longer. The suspicion column was the longest of all. And at the bottom of it, underlined, was a question she had been circling since the night of the attack without landing on it directly. Why the East Corridor specifically? The attack had been designed to look external, Victor had said. The structural failure in the East Wing was the internal component, the piece that was supposed to look like collateral damage but was in fact the primary objective. But why the East Corridor? She had been in the East Corridor because she had gone there for air, because the main hall had been full and warm and heavy with the specific social pressure of an event she was attending as a decoration rather than a participant. She had not told anyone she was going there. She had not announced it. She had simply moved. For the structural failure to have been targeted at her specifically, someone would have needed to know not just her general position at the estate, but her specific real-time position at the moment of the attack. Someone had been watching her, not the security cameras. Victor had told her the security footage from that night had been partially wiped. A clean job, professional. Not the deletion of someone covering tracks quickly, but the precise excision of a trained operator who knew exactly which files to remove and left the rest intact to avoid triggering an investigation into the system itself. Whoever had done that knew the Romano estate's security architecture intimately. That wasn't Selena. Or rather, Selena had the motive and the planning, but the technical execution required someone inside the estate's security operation. Someone with daily access to the system. Someone whose presence at monitoring equipment on the night of the attack would not have raised any flags. She wrote, "Insider in security team. Predates tonight. Long-standing." She stared at what she'd written. Then she wrote, below it, "This person knows Victor's clearance level, knows the air-gapped system exists, may know what Victor has been building." She set the pen down. She picked Thomas up from the bedside cradle Ruth had produced from somewhere in the house's depths and held him against her chest and stood at the window looking at the field. The sky was the flat, pale gray of a cold day with no ambition. A crow was working at something in the far edge of the field. She watched it. If there was an insider in Damien's security team who had been feeding Selena real-time information on the night of the attack, that insider was still there. That insider had access to every operation Victor was planning, every conversation that touched the estate's communication infrastructure, every move Victor made once he walked back through the front gate. She needed to tell him. She had no way to tell him. She held Thomas and breathed and thought about what useful action looked like inside a situation where the available actions were almost entirely passive. Victor and Marcus had been gone for 4 hours and 20 minutes when Ruth appeared in the bedroom doorway. Vivian looked at her face and understood immediately that something had changed. "There's a vehicle on the county road," Ruth said. It's been sitting for 20 minutes. Just sitting. Facing the property, Vivian moved to the window on the property's north side, the one with the angled view through the trees. She could see the county road in a narrow corridor between the willows, and she could see the vehicle, a dark SUV, engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. It wasn't parked the way lost travelers parked. It was positioned. "Back door," Vivian said. "Already unlocked." She looked at Ruth. "Is there anywhere on the property they won't have surveyed?" "The basement." "Show me." The basement was accessed through a door in the pantry, a narrow staircase down into a stone-walled space that smelled of earth and cold and old wood. It had clearly been used for storage and had been recently reorganized. She could see the clean lines of deliberate arrangement, supplies grouped and accessible, a camp lantern on a shelf that Ruth lit with the ease of someone who had lit it before, a sleeping bag on a low cot, a water container. Ruth had built this the way Victor had built his safe house, not in response to this specific crisis, in response to the general condition of the life she had apparently been living for a very long time. "How long can we stay down here?" Vivian said. "Food and water for a week." Ruth looked at Thomas, who was awake and considering the new space with his characteristic seriousness. "Formula in the supply box. He'll be fine." "And if they come through the house?" Ruth looked at her without expression. "There's a door in the north wall behind the second shelving unit. It opens onto a crawl space that runs to the barn. The barn has a second exit into the drainage culvert that runs along the property's east edge." She paused. "The culvert comes out on the far side of the tree line." Vivian stared at her. "Victor didn't build this plan," she said. "No," Ruth said. "You did." Ruth didn't answer. She moved toward the stairs. "I'm going to watch from the upstairs window. If the vehicle moves toward the property, I'll be down in 3 minutes." She stopped on the bottom step and looked back. "Keep the lamp low. Sound carries less than you think, but light travels further than you want." She went up. The pantry door closed with a soft, definite click. Vivian sat down on the cot with Thomas on her lap and turned the lantern to its lowest setting. The basement went to near dark, a dim amber light that showed her the dimensions of the space without advertising them. She settled Thomas against her chest. He made a small noise that was not quite a complaint, more an inquiry, the sound of someone requesting information about the current situation. "I know," she said, very quietly. "Me too." She sat in the dark and waited and thought about Victor walking into the Romano estate with a man Selena might already know to watch for, going after records in a system that a compromised insider might already have flagged, and she thought about how much of this entire plan rested on the assumption that Victor's operational security was intact when every piece of logic she could apply suggested it might not be. Ruth came back down at the 40-minute mark. "They left," she said. "Just left. Drove north." She came down the stairs. "They may have been logging properties for a later visit, or someone saw what they needed to see from the road." She looked at Vivian with her comprehensive, unreadable assessment. "We should stay down here tonight regardless." "I agree." Vivian shifted Thomas, who had fallen asleep again, with the infuriating ease of someone with no concept of stakes. "Ruth, the security insider, in the Romano estate. Do you know who it is?" A silence. Ruth sat down on the wooden storage crate opposite the cot. She folded her hands in her lap, and for the first time in Vivian's observation of her, she looked something other than entirely settled. Not frightened. Ruth did not appear to be someone who did frightened in the conventional sense, but weighted. The specific weight of someone who has been carrying a piece of information in silence for long enough that the silence has become its own kind of burden. "You know," Vivian said. "I know what Victor knows," Ruth said, "because I've been helping him build the picture for longer than he's admitted to you." Vivian waited. "The insider in the security team is a man named Corey Strand. He's been with the Romano organization for 9 years. He was brought in originally through one of the allied family contacts." She paused. "He was brought in through Selena's recommendation. Damien hired him on Selena's recommendation. Yes. 9 years ago. Yes." Vivian absorbed this. 9 years. Whatever Selena had been building, whatever the full architecture of it was, It did not begin in the last 3 years the way Victor had said. It had roots that went back further, had been laid down with a patience and a foresight that was genuinely staggering if you looked at it directly. 9 years of having your own person inside the organization's security infrastructure. 9 years of being able to see everything that was monitored, to shape what was recorded, to know where the gaps were, and make sure they stayed gaps. Victor knows about Strand, she said. Yes. And he went into the estate anyway. Ruth looked at her with an expression that was the closest thing to uncertainty Vivian had seen on her face. Victor believes he can access the system without triggering Strand's monitoring protocols. He believes he knows a window in Strand's rotation. Believes? Yes. Not knows. No. The basement was very quiet. The lamp made its small amber claim against the dark and otherwise did nothing about the situation. How long ago did they leave? Vivian said. Victor and Marcus? 6 hours now. They should have been back in 4 or 5 maximum. Ruth said nothing. This was the moment. She recognized it. The specific moment where the thing you have been managing in your peripheral vision steps directly in front of you and refuses to be managed any further. Victor was 6 hours into what should have been a 4-hour operation at the absolute outside. He was inside a building with an active surveillance asset working against him, with a woman who had been methodically consolidating power for 3 days and had already demonstrated she was willing to use violence as a precision instrument, and Vivian was in a basement with a newborn and no phone and no vehicle and no way to reach anyone. She closed her eyes for 2 seconds. She opened them. Is there any communication capability in this house? She said. Anything that isn't the landline? Ruth was quiet for a moment that told Vivian the answer was yes before Ruth said, There's a radio in the barn, short range. Short range how far? 20 miles, maybe 25. Not far enough to reach the Romano estate, which was 40 miles south. Far enough to reach something else, potentially, if there was something else within that radius worth reaching. Victor's contact at the estate, she said. The woman who sent the warning about Selena, is there any way to reach her? Not directly. Indirectly. Ruth looked at her with the careful assessment of someone deciding whether the next piece of information constitutes a useful tool or a dangerous one in the current operator's hands. Whatever she decided it in Vivian's favor. There's a relay point, she said. A business in the town 12 miles south. The owner passes messages. Does he know you? She. Yes. Can you reach her on the short-range radio? If she's in the building, the radio at her end is in her back office. Ruth paused. It's 9:30 at night. Can you try? Another pause. Longer. Ruth stood up. Watch the lamp, she said, and went up the stairs. Vivian sat in the near dark with Thomas on her chest and counted her own heartbeats for lack of anything more productive to count. She counted to 240, and then she stopped counting and just breathed, and Thomas breathed against her, and the stone walls held the cold the way stone walls do. Absolutely, without concession. Ruth came back in 31 minutes. She came down the stairs with the same composed step she always used, and she sat back down on the crate, and she said nothing immediately, and Vivian watched her face for the information before the words arrived. Victor and Marcus are at the estate, Ruth said. Miriam, my contact's relay, reached the contact 40 minutes ago. They arrived 2 hours after they left here. They got inside. Vivian breathed out. But, Ruth said, she breathed back in. Strand triggered an internal alert 20 minutes after they entered the building. Not a full lockdown, a quiet flag, the kind that goes only to Selena's people without alerting Romano's main security. Victor was already in the records room by then. He had the files. Ruth folded her hands carefully. Marcus was waiting outside in the vehicle. Was. A team intercepted Marcus at the vehicle. 3 men, Selena's private security. Ruth met her eyes. Marcus was taken inside. The basement was completely still. Victor, she said. Victor got out. He has the files. Ruth paused. He doesn't know about Marcus yet. He was already clear of the building when it happened. Miriam's message said he was heading back here, but she lost contact with her source inside the estate immediately after. She thinks Strand identified the communication channel and cut it. which meant their inside source was now compromised or silenced. Marcus was in Selena's custody, and Victor was driving back with the financial records while his nephew sat inside the Romano estate in the hands of a woman who had tried to kill a pregnant woman with a structural collapse and had been planning that specific move for 9 years. She understood what Selena had now. She had not taken Marcus because Marcus was a threat. Marcus was a 24-year-old with no organizational standing and no information she didn't already have access to. Selena had taken Marcus because Marcus was leverage, because Victor had a nephew who was also a liability, and because anyone who understood Victor Hale at all understood that his operational logic had one specific failure point that he worked very hard to keep out of the calculus of his decisions, and that the existence of Marcus made impossible to fully exclude. Selena had taken Marcus to put Victor in a position where no clean choice existed. She had taken Marcus to stop the evidence from arriving anywhere it could do damage. Or she had taken Marcus because she already knew about the evidence, already knew Victor had retrieved it, and taking Marcus was the message. Bring those records anywhere near anyone who matters, and this is what you lose. "When will Victor be here?" Vivian said. "An hour, maybe less." "Wake me when he gets here." Ruth looked at her. "You should sleep." "I'll sleep when he gets here." She looked back. "Wake me." Ruth nodded and went up the stairs. Vivian sat in the amber dark and did not sleep and did not pretend she was going to sleep. She held Thomas and thought about Marcus's face in the farmhouse kitchen, the cut above his eyebrow, the young man's specific combination of impatience and intelligence that she had spent 3 days watching and had come to find something close to moving. She thought about Victor receiving this news. She had a very clear picture of what Victor's face would do, what it would refuse to do, the absolute containment of a man who had spent 30 years sealing off the parts of himself that could be used against him, and who would now have to look at the fact that the sealing had not been complete. She thought about Selena receiving word that Victor had gotten out with the files, because that was the piece that didn't sit right. Ruth had said Strand triggered the internal alert 20 minutes after Victor entered the records room. 20 minutes was enough time for Victor to reach the files if he moved efficiently, but it was also enough time for Strand to have known Victor was in the building almost from the moment he entered, which meant the 20-minute delay before the alert was not a discovery, it was a decision. Strand had waited, had let Victor get into the records room, had let him reach the files. Why? She turned this over and over in the dark until it showed her what it was. Strand had waited because Selena had told him to wait, because Selena did not want Victor caught at the perimeter, where the records were still untouched and the operation's purpose was ambiguous. She wanted Victor caught after he reached the files. She wanted him caught in possession of evidence that, under any framing she chose to apply, looked like a former Romano enforcer stealing organizational intelligence. She had let Victor get the records so she could use his possession of them against him, which meant she had known Victor was coming, had known approximately when, had positioned Strand to manage the timeline, and positioned her own team outside to take Marcus while letting Victor walk free, because a free Victor carrying stolen records was more useful than a captured Victor with nothing on him, and because a captured Marcus was the mechanism that ensured Victor's records never reached anyone who could act on them. It was the same architecture as everything else she had done. She didn't just build traps, she built traps that used your own intelligence and your own loyalties and your own correct decisions against you. She found the thing you were doing right and turned it into the instrument of your failure. Victor arrived at the farmhouse at 11:47. She heard the truck. She was already at the top of the basement stairs by the time Ruth opened the pantry door. Victor came through the back entrance with a drive in his jacket pocket and Marcus's absence in every line of his body. Not the absence of someone who had left Marcus behind safely, but the absence of someone who did not yet know what had been done with what he had left behind. She watched his face change when Ruth told him. She had known what his face would do. She had been right. It did almost nothing. The jaw set. A single, nearly imperceptible movement in the muscle below his left ear. His eyes went somewhere interior for 2 seconds, processing in that locked private room that he permitted no one to observe, and then he came back. "How long ago?" he said. "Miriam's message came through 2 hours ago. The interception happened before that. We estimate 3 hours ago at this point." Ruth handed him a cup of coffee that he took without looking at it. "Your contact inside is dark. We don't know her status. She's not dead, he said. Not a reassurance. A statement of probability, the calculation of a man who understood what Selina needed and what she didn't. She's leverage of a different kind. Strand will have her isolated. He looked at Vivian. You've already worked out what this is. Selina knew you were coming. She let you reach the files. She has Marcus to make sure the files don't go anywhere she can't control. She held his eyes. She let you get out so she could use the possession of stolen organizational records to discredit anything you try to do with them. Yes. He set the coffee down without drinking it. She's good. The words came out flat, in the precise tone of someone assessing a professional's work without any capacity for admiration underneath the assessment. He reached into his jacket and placed the small external drive on the kitchen table. They both looked at it. Everything's on there, he said. The payment records for the attack crew. Communications between Selina and her allied family contacts. The technical specifications for the East Corridor's structural modifications. There's a vendor invoice for the materials, disguised as estate renovation work, with a delivery window that places it 6 weeks before the summit. He paused. And something else. She looked at him. There's a file on there I didn't put together. It was already in the system, in a partition I had to crack a secondary password to reach. It was created 8 months ago and last modified 3 days before the summit. He looked at the drive. It's a document, a contingency document. It covers what Selina planned to do if the attack didn't fully succeed, if Vivian survived, if evidence began to surface. And it names me, he said, by name. It identifies me as the organizer of a conspiracy against the Romano family, with fabricated financial records showing I've been taking payments from the Leng Syndicate for 2 years. If I produce the evidence against her, she produces this. He finally looked at her directly. Every piece of it is fabricated, but the fabrication is meticulous. It took months to build. And the people who matter, the crime family bosses, Damien's own captains, they will have to choose between 2 stories, and they will choose based on who is standing in front of them when the stories are told. The kitchen was very quiet. She doesn't just have Marcus, Vivian said. She has a complete counter-narrative. And 3 days of access to Damien's accounts, and an allied family support structure, and the Strand asset inside the security team. Victor put his hands flat on the table and looked down at them. And I have a drive that, if I produce it, gets me tried as a traitor in absentia, gets Marcus used as an example, and may or may not be believed by a man who has spent the last week being told by the person I'm accusing that his wife is alive and I helped her escape. He stopped. He won't know which story is true. He'll default to the one that requires the least revision of what he already believes. She understood. She had understood before he finished the sentence, but she let him finish it because he needed to say the complete thing. Damien would default to Selina's story because Selina's story required him to believe that the woman he had trusted for 11 years was still trustworthy. Vivian's story, Victor's story, the story on the drive, required him to believe that 11 years of his life had been built on a foundation that had been methodically undermined by the one person he had never fully questioned. Human beings, including ruthless ones, including powerful ones, ran from that kind of revision. They ran from it the way they ran from physical pain, with the same animal urgency, with the same fundamental preference for the lie that hurt less. She picked up the drive. She turned it over in her fingers. It was small and unremarkable, the kind of hardware you could buy in any electronics shop, the vessel for the only thing standing between Selina Voss's permanent consolidation of power and something that could be called justice with a straight face. She held it and thought. She needs Marcus alive, she said. For now. She needs him alive and visible as long as the threat of producing him is worth more than the cost of keeping him. The moment the leverage question resolves, one way or another. I know, Victor said. So we have a window. A small one. How small? Days. If we're wrong about our timeline, maybe less. She set the drive back on the table. Then we need to change the equation. We need to change it before she can execute on any part of her contingency plan. We need to be in the same room as Damien Romano, Victor said, with every piece of evidence on that drive, in front of witnesses he can't ignore. He looked at her. before Selena can present her counter-narrative. She thought about what that required. Not just access to Damien. Selena now had substantial control over who reached Damien, what information he received, how his schedule was structured, and his environment managed. Getting to Damien Romano privately was functionally impossible. Getting to him in a controlled setting where she could be silenced was worse than useless. She needed something Selena couldn't control. She needed a space with witnesses and a structure that, once initiated, could not be stopped from the inside. She looked at Victor. The remaining family bosses, the ones who survived the summit and haven't yet committed to either side of the war between Romano and Leng. He was quiet. "There are 3 of them," she said. It wasn't a question, Sub. She had been building the organizational map for days. This was one of the things she was fairly certain of. They're waiting to see how the Romano-Leng conflict resolves before they move. They have standing to call a council meeting, a formal one, the kind where all relevant parties present their position. "A formal council requires the participation of all senior members," Victor said. "Selena would be present. She would have advance warning. She would have a counter-narrative prepared," Vivian said. "I know. That's why the order matters. We need to reach the 3 neutral bosses before Selena does. We need to give them enough of what's on that drive to make them call the council as an investigation rather than a diplomatic meeting." She looked at him steadily. "And we need to arrive at that council with something Selena cannot counter-narrative away." "What?" "Me," she said. "And Thomas." The word landed in the kitchen and stayed there. Victor looked at her. He looked at Thomas, who was in Ruth's arms by the doorway, asleep with his usual comprehensive commitment. He looked back at Vivian. "If Damien sees you," he began. "If Damien sees me, with Thomas, with the evidence on that drive, in front of 3 neutral bosses who are already holding preliminary evidence, Selena's counter-narrative requires him to believe that I faked my own death, that you fabricated months of financial records, and that his own son is part of the deception." She held Victor's eyes. "Men have believed stranger things to protect what they want to believe, but not that, not with the child standing in front of him." Victor was quiet for a very long time. Ruth was quiet. The farmhouse made its small nighttime sounds around them. "You're asking me to walk you into a room with every powerful criminal organization on the East Coast and the woman who tried to have you killed," Victor said. "I'm asking you to help me walk into that room," she said. "There's a difference. If it goes wrong, we lose everything anyway. We're already at the bottom, Victor. The only direction from here is through." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "Reach the neutral bosses. Show them enough of the drive to make the council inevitable. And get Marcus out before Selena understands what we're doing." "Marcus first," he said immediately. "Marcus first," she agreed. "Then the bosses. Then the council." He looked at the drive on the table. He looked at her. He picked up the drive and put it back in his jacket pocket and did not say anything else, because nothing else was required. She could see in the set of his shoulders that the decision had been made, that whatever internal war he had been fighting between caution and necessity had resolved itself in the direction she needed it to resolve. Ruth brought Thomas to her. She held him against her chest. He stirred, made his small sound, settled. She thought about 5 years. Not the 5 years she had been imagining vaguely, abstractly, as a measure of the time this might take. She thought about the specific 5 years ahead of her, what they would require, what they would cost, what she would have to be willing to become in order to reach the other side of them with this child intact, and the truth in a form that anyone with power would actually act on. She was not, had never been, a violent person. She did not think of herself as someone capable of the specific, cold-blooded ruthlessness she had observed in people like Victor, or like Damien at his most operational, or like Selena. God, especially like Selena, who had refined ruthlessness into something approaching art. She had always understood herself as someone who operated in proximity to that world without belonging to its interior, someone who maintained a certain fundamental remove. She was going to have to let go of that understanding, not become something monstrous. She was not interested in becoming something monstrous. She had seen what that looked like and what it required and what it ultimately produced. But the comfortable distance she had maintained between herself and the full weight of what this world demanded, was a luxury that Selena Voss had taken from her on the night of the summit in that east corridor, under the falling ceiling, with a precision that had been 9 years in the making. She was going to have to be something she had not been before, something that did not have a comfortable name, something that looked at what was required and did it without the protective layer of telling herself she was different. She looked down at Thomas. His gray eyes were open, looking at her with their serious, searching attention. "Okay," she said very quietly, to him, to herself, to the version of herself she was making the decision to become. Outside the farmhouse, somewhere on a county road 2 miles north, a set of headlights turned deliberately off before a vehicle slowed to a stop. And in the sudden dark, 3 doors opened in sequence, and the sound of footsteps moved toward the tree line with the specific, unhurried patience of people who had been told to wait and had finally been told to stop waiting. The headlights had been off for 4 minutes before Victor saw them. He saw them because he had been watching the tree line since midnight, standing at the farmhouse's north-facing window with the lamp extinguished and his weapon in his hand, and the particular quality of attention that 30 years of this life had burned into him permanently. Not watchfulness exactly, more a state of continuous, low-level threat assessment that never fully disengaged, not even in sleep, not even in the rare moments of genuine peace that had grown rarer with every passing year. He saw the darkness where headlights had been, and his body understood what his mind was still catching up to, and he was already moving toward the kitchen before the first door of the vehicle opened. "Ruth," he said. She was already up. He didn't know if she had slept. He had begun to suspect she didn't, or that she had some internal calibration that brought her upright the moment the threat level in the environment shifted in ways that registered below conscious awareness. She came into the kitchen with her boots already on. "North tree line," he said. 3, possibly 4. "Vivian is in the basement. Get down there with her. Use the barn exit if you hear anyone come through the front or back doors. Don't wait to confirm who it is, just move." Ruth was already moving toward the pantry. "Victor?" Vivian's voice from the basement doorway. She had come part way up the stairs, enough to hear. "How many?" "Go back down." "How many?" "3 that I can see. Could be more at the road." He looked at her. In the near dark of the kitchen, her face was completely composed, which was the thing about her that he had stopped finding surprising and started finding, in a way he didn't examine closely, something close to reassuring. "I need you in the basement. If they get through me, you need to be at the barn exit already." A pause. 1 second, 2. Then, "Don't let them get through you." She went back down. The pantry door clicked shut. He went to the back door and out into the cold. The night was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that sharpens everything. Sound traveled further. Edges were precise. His breath made a small cloud that he controlled instinctively, shallow and slow to minimize. He moved along the exterior wall of the house toward the north, keeping the wall at his shoulder, his weapon up and close to his body. The ground was hard and dry underfoot, and he placed each step with deliberate care. He heard them before he saw them. 3 sets of footsteps in the tree line, not trying to be quiet, which told him something. People who moved through the dark without trying to be quiet were either untrained or were making a calculated decision that speed mattered more than stealth, which meant they expected resistance and had decided to meet it directly rather than avoid it. Professional then, or confident. The two things were not always the same. He pressed himself against the corner of the house and waited. The first figure came out of the tree line at a diagonal toward the farmhouse's north wall. Male, heavy through the chest, moving with the forward-weighted stance of someone who had been in physical altercations and had opinions about how to enter them. He had a weapon at his hip and a radio clipped to his jacket that gave off a faint static. Someone was on the other end of that radio, monitoring. Which meant there were more people somewhere in the picture who weren't in the tree line. Victor put him down with 2 seconds of efficient work that he had no feelings about and moved immediately to his right, toward the second figure who was still in the shadows at the tree line's edge, now frozen by the sound of the first man going down. That moment of freeze, that single beat of surprised recalculation, was all he needed. The second man made a sound that was cut short and then made no more sounds. The third was smarter. The third had used the 2 seconds to move laterally and put a tree between himself and Victor's position, and Victor could hear him on the radio. A quick clip transmission, 6 words or less, impossible to make out from this distance. Calling it in. Telling whoever was at the road that the approach had gone wrong. Victor moved fast. He went for the tree line rather than the open ground, using the darkness under the canopy, moving through it by memory and by the sound of the man ahead of him. Breathing that was controlled but not quite controlled enough. The shift of boots on frozen ground, the specific frequency of a person trying very hard to be still while their body was running on adrenaline and losing the argument. He found him backed against an oak with the radio still in his hand and the weapon raised and Victor already inside the weapon's effective angle by the time the man's eyes registered he was there. "Down," Victor said. The man looked at him for 1 second with the rapid calculating look of someone running probabilities. Then he put the radio and the weapon on the ground and put his hands up. "Radio call," Victor said. "What did you say?" "Contact. North approach failed." "Who's at the road?" Silence. "There are 2 ways this goes," Victor said. He was not breathing hard. He was not performing calm. He simply was calm, the specific flatness of a man for whom this situation was not an emergency but a problem requiring a solution, and the distinction was visible and it did its work. "One of them involves you telling me what I asked. The other one takes longer and you don't walk away from it. How many people at the road?" 4. "Selena's people." Not a question. The man didn't bother denying it. He had the look of someone who had already done his own probability calculation and arrived at an answer that prioritized survival over loyalty, which told Victor that Selena's hold on her peripheral assets was financial rather than genuine, which was useful information of a different kind. "Is she with them?" "No." "Where is she?" "I don't know." Victor looked at him. He had a specific internal instrument for detecting the difference between a lie and a genuine absence of information, calibrated over 30 years, and it told him this was the latter. The man genuinely did not know where Selena was. She didn't share her position with assets she was willing to send into a situation that might go sideways. "There's a drainage culvert on the east edge of the property," Victor said. "You're going to walk to it, and you're going to keep walking east until you hit the county road north of here. You're not going to use your radio. You're not going to contact anyone until you're 20 miles from this property." He held the man's eyes with the flat, total certainty of someone who has absolutely no doubt about his own capacity to make promises that matter. "If I hear that radio in the next 3 minutes, I'll find you." The man left. Victor went back to the farmhouse. He went to the basement door and knocked twice, paused, knocked once, the pattern they had agreed on, and Ruth opened it, and Vivian came up the stairs with Thomas in the carrier strapped to her chest, and the look on her face of someone who has spent the last 8 minutes in a basement waiting for information and is done waiting. "The approach team is neutralized," he said. "There are 4 more at the road. They're going to come to the house when the radio call doesn't resolve." "How long?" 10 minutes. Less." "Then we go now," she said. He had not expected her to argue. She had not disappointed him. They moved through the barn and into the drainage culvert while Victor's truck was still at the back of the property, decoy positioned with its parking lights on to suggest occupation. Ruth came with them. She had made this decision without announcement at some point while he was in the tree line, and he had no argument against it and suspected she had anticipated that. The culvert was low and cold and smelled of old water and frozen earth, and Vivian moved through it without complaint, one hand braced against the culvert wall for balance, the other pressed to Thomas's back through the carrier. The infant was awake. Vivian could feel it. Not fussing, not making any of the sounds that would have been catastrophic in this particular enclosed space, just awake and alert in his characteristic way, as if he understood through some channel that had nothing to do with language that now was not the time. They came out in the field east of the property. There was a second vehicle, Ruth's, a 10-year-old sedan that she had staged here 2 days ago with a quiet competence that Victor had acknowledged with a single nod at the time, and felt the full weight of now. They got in. Ruth drove, because this was her terrain and her route, and Victor sat in the passenger seat watching the mirrors, and Vivian sat in the back with Thomas, and did not look at the farmhouse as they left it behind, because looking back at things you were leaving was not a habit she could afford to develop. They drove south and east, away from the county road where Selena's 4 remaining assets were presumably converging on a farmhouse that was about to tell them nothing, and Victor made 2 calls from a burner phone he had been holding since the estate, and said very little on either one, and hung up and looked out the passenger window. "The neutral bosses," Vivian said. "Castellano and Wen. Those are the 2 you reached." Castellano confirmed. Wen confirmed. They've each seen 2 files from the drive. They understand what they're looking at. And Drayton. Drayton is the problem. She had known Drayton would be the problem. Ellison Drayton was the oldest of the 3 neutral bosses, 70-something, with an organization that had survived 3 generations of the East Coast's criminal reorganizations by maintaining a consistent policy of absolute non-involvement in other families' internal conflicts. He did not take sides. He did not attend councils convened for investigative purposes. He did not put himself in rooms where the outcome was uncertain. He had survived as long as he had by understanding that the man who outlasts a war is often worth more than the man who wins it. "If Drayton doesn't participate," she said, "Selena can claim the council isn't legitimate. She'll claim it anyway. With Drayton, it's a claim she can't make stick. Without him, it's a claim she can make to every undecided captain in the Romano organization, and it'll land." She looked at Victor's profile. "Drayton has to be in the room." "I know." "Then how do we get him in the room?" Victor was quiet for a mile. Ruth drove. The road was empty in both directions, flat through the winter fields, the occasional distant light of a property set back from the road making its small, isolated statement against the dark. "Drayton's granddaughter," Victor said. "She's 22. She's been working the legitimate side of his organization for 18 months with clean business, no connection to anything operational. She wants to move further in. Drayton has been resistant. Because he wants her clean. Because he wants her clean. And she is the one person in his life that he would do something uncharacteristic for." He paused. "I know where she is. If she understands what's at stake, if she understands that not having Drayton in the room means Selena's version of events becomes the accepted version, and Selena's version names Wen and Castellano as Romano enemies who conspired with the Leng Syndicate, it changes the calculation for her. You'd put her in the middle of this. She'd choose to put herself in the middle of this. I'd show her the door." Vivian thought about this for 3 seconds. "Do it." They reached the city by dawn. Not Harwick. They drove south and east past Harwick, past its suburbs and its particular architecture of concealed violence, past the exits that would have taken them toward the Romano estate, and into the adjacent metropolitan area, a city called Delham, that was large enough and sufficiently indifferent to be useful. Victor had an apartment there, in a building whose super had known him for 12 years, and whose questions, consequently, numbered exactly 0. They were inside with the door locked and the lights low by 6:15 in the morning. Marcus was still at the Romano estate. This was the constant. She had been holding it since Ruth's message in the farmhouse basement, carrying it the way you carry something heavy that you cannot set down, consciously, at all times, with the awareness of its weight shaping every other decision. Victor held it differently, she could see. In his jaw, in the way he moved through the apartment, checking its geometry with the automatic thoroughness of a man who needed to be doing something with his hands and his body so that the other thing had somewhere to be that wasn't the surface of every thought. "He's leverage," she said from the kitchen table. "Selena needs him functional. For now." Victor didn't turn from the window. "She won't move on him until she has to, until she knows what we're doing. She already knows we got out of the farmhouse. Her approach team didn't come back with us. She knows we got out. She doesn't know where we went or what our next step is." She pressed her hands flat on the table. "We have a window. It's small. 48 hours, he said. Maybe 60. After that, the council window closes. Castellano and Wen can't maintain their position indefinitely without it looking like they're already committed against Romano. And if it looks like they're committed, Selena uses that to accelerate Damien's war posture, and the whole picture shifts. Then 48 hours is what we have." He turned from the window. He looked at her across the apartment with the expression of a man making a final assessment, not of the plan which had been assessed, but of her. Whether she was going to hold. Whether the 48 hours would find her at the end of it still upright, still functional, still able to walk into a room and do what walking into that room was going to require. She looked back at him and did not perform confidence, because she had decided early in this that performing confidence for Victor was a waste of time and a mild insult to his intelligence. She just looked at him steadily and let him see whatever he was going to see. He looked for a moment. Then he nodded, once, and turned to the phone. The next 36 hours were the specific grinding work of the interval before something terrible and necessary. Victor reached Drayton's granddaughter. Her name was Petra, and she listened to what Victor said on the phone with a silence that was not passive but concentrated. And at the end, she said, "Send me the 2 files." And when he did, she called back in 40 minutes and said, "Noon tomorrow. He'll be there." Victor reached Castellano and Wen with the finalized council location. A neutral property, a decommissioned private social club in Delham, owned by a holding company that nobody present had any direct affiliation with. He arranged for a security perimeter using people he trusted with the specific trust of a man who knows exactly where each person's loyalty lives and has spent decades making sure it lives somewhere durable. Vivian spent those 36 hours preparing. Not emotionally. She had moved past the territory where preparation meant processing feeling. She prepared in the way she had come to understand was the only kind of preparation that mattered in this specific context, which was the preparation of information. She went through every file on the drive. She read the payment records and the communication logs and the vendor invoice and the contingency document that Victor had found, Selena's counter-narrative, the fabricated case against Victor, meticulous and cold and organized with the same architectural intelligence that characterized everything else Selena had built. She read it and understood specifically why it was dangerous, which was not because it was convincing in isolation, but because it was convincing to someone who already wanted to be convinced. She thought about Damien. She thought about him more than she had in the weeks at the farmhouse, when she had been deliberate about keeping that particular door mostly closed. She thought about what she was going to say when she saw him. Not the evidence. The evidence would be handled by what was on the drive, and what Castellano and Wen had already seen, and by Petra Drayton standing in that room to indicate that even Ellison Drayton, who involved himself in nothing, had found this compelling enough to send his granddaughter. She thought about what she was going to say to Damien Romano as a person, face to face, in a room where everyone present would be watching both of them for the human subtext beneath the political transaction. She did not arrive at a satisfying answer. She decided to accept that. They reached the social club at 11:40 in the morning. The building was a narrow 4-story brownstone on a street of brownstones, distinguished from its neighbors only by the absence of any identifying signage and the presence of 2 of Victor's people at the entrance who were doing the passive work of men who were not visibly doing anything. Inside, a ground floor room that had once been a dining room and still had the long table and the chairs and the faded landscape paintings that nobody had removed when the club closed, which gave the space a quality that she found either grimly appropriate or simply grim, depending on which second of the minute she was in. Castellano was already there. He was a compact man in his 60s with the kind of contained energy that operated as its own authority without requiring any performance of it. He looked at Vivian when she came in with the specific, comprehensive assessment of a man in his position encountering something he had been told to expect, but was recalibrating against the reality. He looked at Thomas in the carrier at her chest. His face did something small and controlled. "Mrs. Romano," he said. "Mr. Castellano." She met his eyes. "Thank you for being here." "I'm here because what I've seen on that drive would have compelled any rational person to be here," he said. "I want to be clear that this is not sentiment. I understand." Wen arrived at 11:55. He was younger than Castellano by 15 years, moving with the brisk economy of someone who runs a large operation and has permanently reduced every non-essential movement from his repertoire. He shook Victor's hand and looked at Vivian and said nothing, which she read as neither hostility nor endorsement, but as the particular position of a man who is reserving all judgment for what happened in the next hour. Petra Drayton came in at noon precisely. She was young and sharp-featured and carried herself with the particular stance of someone who has been told their entire life that they are not ready for a room and has decided to stop listening. She looked at Vivian and said, My grandfather said to tell you, if this is what you say it is, the Drayton organization will not oppose any action taken against Selena Voss. She paused. He also said you have 20 minutes before he changes his mind, because he has been changing his mind about coming since 4 o'clock this morning. Understood, Vivian said. Then Damien Romano came through the door. She had not known Victor had reached him. She had not known Damien had agreed to come. She understood in the fractional second after the door opened, and she saw him that Victor had made this decision without telling her, had calculated that her preparation for the room would be different if she knew Damien was coming than if she didn't, and that the version of her who walked in not knowing was the version most likely to do this correctly. She would deal with that later. Damien Romano stood in the doorway of the old dining room and looked at her, and whatever script he had been running, whatever Selena had given him for this scenario, whatever version of the counter-narrative had been feeding his understanding of events for the past week, she could see it fail in real time, not instantly. It took 3 seconds, which were the longest 3 seconds she had spent in a week that had contained a great many long seconds. She watched it fail the way a load-bearing wall fails. From within, the exterior holding for a moment after the structure inside had already given way, and then the exterior going too. His face did something she had no word for. He looked at Thomas. Thomas, who had Damien's eyes and was currently regarding the assembled company with the serious, investigative attention of a person encountering a new and stimulating environment, and who was, in the specific metric of this moment, doing more work than anyone else in the room. Damien, Victor said, sit down. Damien sat down. He sat down like his legs had resolved the question before the rest of him had, and he put both hands flat on the table and looked at the table and then looked back up at Vivian and said, in a voice that had something in it she had never heard in his voice before, a quality of complete internal disorientation that the performance machinery could not quite cover. You're alive. Yes, she said. The baby, his name is Thomas. She held his eyes. He's 4 days old. Damien looked at Thomas again. Something moved through his face that was not something she had the ability to be moved by, not here, not now, but that she registered and filed with the part of her that was still human enough to register and file it. Sit down, Vivian, Victor said quietly. She sat. Victor placed the drive on the table. He placed a printed summary beside it, 12 pages, organized chronologically, covering every element of Selena's operation from the initial recruitment of Corey Strand 9 years ago through the fabrication of the counter-narrative 3 days before the summit. He had prepared this summary last night at the Dellum apartment while she slept for 3 hours, and she saw now why he had done it. Because the drive was evidence, but the summary was a story, and a story with witnesses was something different from evidence in isolation. What is this? Damien said. He was looking at Victor. Read the first 3 pages, Victor said. Victor. Damien. The 2 syllables came out with 30 years of weight behind them. Read the first 3 pages. Damien read the first 3 pages. The room was completely quiet while he read. Castellano and Wen had their copies. Victor had made 4 sets, physical copies, handed them out before Damien entered. Petra Drayton read with the focused speed of someone who was here to extract specific information and already had what she needed but was making sure. Damien read like a man walking through a building he thought he knew and finding that every room behind every door he opens is a room he has never been in. He got to page 3 and stopped. He set the pages down on the table. He pressed his hands flat against the table again, the gesture she recognized as his body's response to the need for a fixed point when the interior landscape was in motion. He looked at Victor. Strand, he said. Yes. 9 years. Yes. And you knew about this. I've been building the picture for 6 months, Victor said. I came to you 18 months ago with preliminary concerns about operational security. You told me to put the report through Selena's intelligence review. A silence. She watched Damien absorb this, the specific, horrible recursion of it, the way every effort to address the problem had been routed through the problem, which was the elegance of what Selena had built, the reason it had lasted as long as it had. The East Corridor, Damien said. He was not looking at Victor anymore. He was looking at the table, at the grain of the old wood, with the fixed and slightly unfocused attention of a man looking at something that isn't what he appears to be looking at. It was meant for... Yes, Vivian said. He looked at her. Structural modifications to the East Wing support columns, she said. 6 weeks before the summit. There's a vendor invoice on the drive, disguised as renovation materials. There are communications between Selena and 2 men at the summit who assisted with the access. She kept her voice level. She was not going to give him the anger now. The anger had its place and its time, and this was not it. The power failure, the structural collapse, the wiped security footage, it was one operation. The summit attack was designed to provide cover. I was the primary target. And the child, Castellano said, from his end of the table. And the child, she said. Damien made a sound that was not quite anything. Not a word, not a name, just a sound that came from somewhere below articulation. His hands were still flat on the table, but the tendons in them were standing up. Where is she? He said. Quiet. Completely quiet. The quiet of something very large compressing into a very small space. She's in the Romano estate, Victor said. She has been managing your intelligence operations and your accounts for 6 days. She has a private security team on the grounds. She has Corey Strand inside your security system. He paused. She has Marcus. Damien's head came up. You're Marcus. Yes. Since when? 6 days. Something shifted in Damien Romano's face that she had never seen there. Not the performance of the Dawn, not the controlled effect of a man who ruled by managing what others could read in him, but the raw version, stripped of everything that usually covered it. He was 60 seconds from operational. She could see it the way you see weather coming, the gathering of something that had not yet broken. Damien, she said. He looked at her. Not yet, she said. Not before we do this correctly. She has a 19-year-old... I know! And if you go into that estate without this having gone on record first, with these witnesses, with this evidence formally presented, she walks away clean. She has the counter-narrative. She has the fabricated evidence against Victor. She has enough of your organization under her influence to make any action you take look like a Don who lost his judgment. She held his eyes and did not blink and did not soften it. You go in there right now and she wins. She has planned for you going in there right now. She has planned for everything except this room. He breathed through his nose. Once, twice. She watched the operational calculation run behind his eyes, watched it fight the thing underneath the calculation that was not calculation at all, and watched the calculation win. Because Damien Romano at his absolute worst was still a man who knew how to think. What do you need? He said. I need you to confirm in front of these witnesses that you accept what is on that drive as the basis for formal action against Selena Voss and Corey Strand within the framework of the council. She held his eyes. And then I need you to help Victor get Marcus out of that estate without Selena knowing we're coming for the rest of her operation until we're already inside. The room was still. Castellano and Wen and Petra Drayton were the kind of still that meant they had understood that what they were witnessing was not political positioning, but something more fundamental, and they were giving it the space it required. Damien Romano looked at Vivienne Ashcroft across the old dining table of a decommissioned social club in Delham, with his 4-day-old son on her chest and 6 days of her being dead in the world's version of events behind them. And whatever he had believed about this situation 1 hour ago, whatever Selena had given him for a story to inhabit, it was gone, visibly and completely gone. And what was left in the absence of it was a man she had never actually seen before. Not the Don. Not the husband. Not the besotted, blinded architect of his own destruction. Something that was underneath all of those, that had apparently been underneath all of them for a very long time, that was looking at her now with the specific, undisguised expression of someone confronting the exact size and shape of the damage they have done. He said, I confirm it. Castellano wrote something on the printed summary in front of him and signed it, and passed it to Wen, who did the same. Petra Drayton signed for her grandfather without hesitation. Victor signed. He placed the stack of signed pages in front of Vivian. She signed. Damien signed last. Victor collected the pages and replaced them with a single sheet, the operational plan for the estate. Marcus's likely location, Strand's shift rotation, the security team's positions, the three possible entry points that Selena's people didn't cover because she had never anticipated this particular convergence. Victor had built this in the apartment at 4 in the morning, and it was, she thought, looking at it now, the product of 30 years of operational intelligence compressed into a single, ruthlessly efficient page. The window opens in 3 hours, Victor said. Strand's rotation changes at 4 in the afternoon. Between 4 and 4:40, the records room is unmanned, and the secondary monitoring goes to a single terminal that we can loop with a 14-minute feed. He looked at Damien. Your people need to hold their positions until we have Marcus clear of the building. Any movement before that, and Selena escalates, and Marcus becomes a different kind of problem. My people will hold, Damien said. I need your word. The two men looked at each other across 30 years. You have it, Damien said. Victor nodded. He looked at the operational sheet. He looked at Damien. He looked at Vivian. She nodded back. 3 hours. They had 3 hours and a plan and a window that would not stay open, and a woman on the other end of it who had been building toward this moment for 9 years and would be expecting something, just not this, not quite this, not the specific combination of the drive and the council and the signatures and the fact of Vivian Romano sitting alive and documented in a room with 3 neutral bosses who had all just put their names on paper. Selena had planned for everything except the one thing Vivian had understood from the farmhouse basement and held on to since. The one thing Selena could not plan for was the version of Vivian that had been made by what Selena had done to her. The version that had been built by 6 days of losing everything and refusing to stay lost. Thomas made his small sound. She put her hand on his back. He settled. She looked at the operational sheet and memorized it, and when the 3 hours were gone, she would walk back into the life that had nearly killed her, and she would not be the woman who had stood in the main hall of the Romano estate with a champagne glass and a feeling she couldn't name. She would be something Selena had made without meaning to, and she would use it, and she would not look away from what using it required. And in the space between knowing this and doing it, she sat at the old dining table and breathed and held her son and waited for the clock to reach the moment where waiting ended and everything else. The clock reached 4. Victor went in first. The estate's east service entrance was the same door Vivian had pushed through on the night of the summit, the same cold metal handle, the same threshold between the building's controlled interior and whatever was outside it. Victor moved through it with 2 of Damien's people behind him. Not Romano's regulars, not anyone Strand had visibility on, but men from a separate structure that Damien had maintained outside the organization's primary architecture for exactly the kind of contingency that had apparently always been coming. They moved through the service corridor without lights, navigating by the floor plan Victor had rebuilt from memory, and Strand's terminal was looping a 14-minute feed of an empty records room while the real records room sat open and unwatched. Marcus was in the east basement. Vivian had not known this when they planned the approach, but Victor had suspected it. Had suspected it because the east basement was the one area of the estate where Selena's private security presence was lightest. Because Selena's instinct was always to hide things in plain sight's opposite, in the place you would not look because it was too obvious. He was in a room that had been used for storage, seated on the floor with his wrists bound, with the kind of practical efficiency that indicated professional rather than vindictive intent, which told Victor that Selena had instructed her people to keep him functional. His left eye was swollen nearly shut. His lip was split. He was, otherwise, intact. He looked up when Victor came through the door and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "You're late." "I know," Victor said. He cut the restraints. Marcus stood up slowly, with the careful inventory of a person checking what still works. He put his hand on the wall, got his balance, took it away. He looked at Victor with the swollen eye and the split lip, and something underneath both of those that was not injury. "I didn't tell them anything," he said. "I know," Victor said again. Marcus nodded. They left the room. They had Marcus clear of the building at 4:19. Damien's people held their positions, as promised, until the confirmation came through on Victor's radio. 2 clicks, the signal they had agreed on, and then what had been held released all at once, from every approach simultaneously, and the estate became a different kind of place than it had been for the preceding 6 days. Selena was in Damien's office. She was at his desk when the first of Damien's men came through the office door, and she understood immediately and completely what had happened. Vivian could see this when she entered the office 60 seconds later, could see it in the absolute stillness of Selena's posture, the way she had stopped exactly where she was and was performing the rapid recalculation of a person who had planned for many contingencies and was now identifying which one still applied. She looked at Vivian standing in the doorway with Thomas in the carrier and the signed council documents in her hand and Victor behind her, and Damien Romano coming through the side entrance, and for the first time in every interaction Vivian had observed or could reconstruct, Selena Voss had nothing immediate to say. This lasted 4 seconds. "Damien," Selena said. She did not look away from Vivian. Her voice was entirely controlled. "Whatever she has told you, we have the drive," Damien said. "We have the vendor records for the East Wing. We have Strand in custody. We have the communications between you and the 2 men at the summit." He stopped. He was not performing anything. That was the thing about his voice right now. It was the voice of a man who had finished performing, who had nothing left to perform for. "We have the contingency document you built against Victor." A pause. "The council has already met," Vivian said. "Castellano, when, Drayton's representative. Signed, on record." She held Selena's eyes. "There's no version of the counter-narrative that works now." Selena looked at her for a long moment. Whatever assessment she was running, she ran it completely and without visible distress. And when she finished running it, her expression settled into something that was almost, in the specific economy of her face, resignation, though resignation was not quite right. It was the expression of a chess player who has seen, with total clarity, that the position is lost, and who is deciding how to lose it. "You survived the corridor," Selena said. Her voice was even. "I didn't account for Victor moving independently." "No," Vivian said. "I should have." "Yes." Neither of them looked away. The room held the weight of 9 years and a falling ceiling and a week of running through the dark, and it held it in the complete silence of everyone present, understanding that what was being said and not said between these 2 women was the actual substance of everything that had happened. "The child is his," Selena said. Not a question. She was looking at Thomas. "Yes." Selena looked at Thomas for a moment with an expression that Vivian could not fully read and did not try to. Then she looked at Damien, and in that look, finally, was the only thing Vivian had ever seen in Selena Voss's face that was not strategic, something stripped and plain and human, the compressed residue of 11 years. And it lasted exactly as long as it could afford to before Selena shut it down and straightened and said nothing more. Damien did not look at her. He was looking at Thomas. Corey Strand was taken into custody that evening, along with 4 members of Selena's private security team. The financial records were turned over through channels that Victor had spent 2 days establishing, carefully negotiated legal contacts, prosecutors who had been building adjacent cases for years, and received what amounted to a foundational gift. The 2 summit men who had assisted with the East Wing modification were named in the documents and subsequently picked up within 72 hours. The Romano family's allied structure absorbed the disclosure with the specific, pragmatic efficiency of organizations that have survived by adapting to the loss of individual components, and the Romano-Leng conflict de-escalated inside a week once the Leng syndicate received confirmation, through Castellano, that the original attack had been internal. Victor handled most of this. Damien handled the rest. Vivian watched and contributed where her contribution was useful, and did not pretend that her role in the organizational aftermath was anything other than what it was: peripheral, advisory, the position of someone who has ended something rather than someone rebuilding it. She and Damien did not reconcile. This was perhaps the thing most worth saying plainly, because the story had the shape of something that wanted to end differently, that wanted the council and the evidence and the child to add up to a restoration of what had existed before. They did not reconcile, because what had existed before was not worth restoring. What had existed before was Vivian standing in the main hall of the estate with a champagne glass and a feeling she couldn't name, watching Damien look at Selena with the unguarded face he never showed her. He came to her twice in the weeks after, both times in the Dellum apartment, which she remained in because it was practical, and because she was not ready to return to the estate and was not certain she ever would be. He came and he sat across the kitchen table from her, and he looked at Thomas with the expression of a man encountering something he does not have the framework for, and he said the things that people say when they are trying to account for themselves without being able to fully account for themselves. She listened. She did not perform forgiveness, and she did not perform its opposite. She told him what she needed, which was for Thomas to know his father, and what she required, which was that the decisions affecting Thomas's life would be made between them and not made for her. He agreed. She believed him, which was not the same as trusting him, and she had decided that the difference between believing and trusting was a distance she was entitled to maintain for as long as she needed to. Marcus healed. The eye and the lip and whatever had happened in that basement that he did not describe in detail and that she did not press him on. He came to the apartment twice a week for the first month and held Thomas with the careful seriousness of someone who has decided that this particular task deserves his complete attention. And he talked to Thomas in a low, conversational voice about nothing in particular. And Thomas regarded him with the gray-eyed assessment that Vivian had come to understand was simply the way her son looked at the world, as something worth examining carefully before rendering judgment. Victor remained. This was not something she had asked for or anticipated. He simply continued to be present with the same unconditional, undemonstrative consistency he had brought to everything since the night he pulled her arm in the dark outside the estate. He was not family in any definition she had access to. He was not a friend, precisely, in the sense that friendship implied a reciprocity of need that she wasn't certain Victor had the architecture for. He was something that didn't have a clean name, and she had decided that the absence of a clean name was not a problem requiring solution. Ruth sent word, 3 months later, through channels, that the farmhouse was cleared and the truck had been recovered and everything was as it had been before. She sent nothing else and Vivian sent nothing back because nothing needed to be sent, and that too was a kind of language she had learned to use. 1 year after the summit, on a morning in early winter, Vivian drove to the Romano estate. Not to live there, she had made other arrangements, clean ones, outside the organization's orbit. She drove there because Thomas was a year old, approximately, counting forward from the night in Ruth's farmhouse, and she had decided that he was going to see the place without understanding what it was. Just see it, have it in his visual memory as something ordinary rather than as the weight of everything she carried about it. She parked on the road and got out and held him on her hip, and they looked at the building from a distance. The estate had been partially renovated. The east wing bore the marks of the restoration work, new stone matching the old with the slightly too clean precision of new material. The grounds were maintained. The driveway was empty. Thomas looked at it with his characteristic seriousness. He put his hand on her jaw and turned her face toward him with the imperious certainty of someone who has decided that whatever she is looking at is less important than he is, which was, she thought, probably accurate. She looked at him. He had Damien's eyes and her jaw, and something in the set of his expression that belonged to neither of them, some third thing that was entirely his own, that had been his own since that cold, amber-lit basement where he had been born into circumstances that would have broken a great many people and had simply, without drama, arrived. She thought about the champagne, the way the bubbles rose and disappeared, the things she had known and not acted on. She thought, I know different things now. She put her son back in the car and drove away from the estate without looking back at it because she had finally, completely stopped needing to.